Well, good evening, everyone. I think most of you in the audience have been with us since the beginning yesterday of the Aspen Security Forum, but there are probably a couple of new faces, so for your benefit, I'll introduce myself. I'm Clark Irvin, the director of the Homeland Security Program at the Aspen Institute, and also the organizer of the first annual Aspen Security Forum. We are delighted to have as our featured guest for the closing session the former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Those of us in Washington in the Homeland Security business all agree, whether we're Republicans or Democrats, that Secretary Chertoff set the gold standard for Homeland Security secretaries. And we're delighted that you're our featured guest tonight. To moderate this session with the Secretary, we're very, very pleased to have Catherine Herridge from Fox News. Catherine Herridge is an award-winning correspondent for the Fox News channel based in Washington, and she covers intelligence, the Justice Department, as well as, of course, the Department of Homeland Security. Catherine and her small team of experienced journalists traveled across the United States and to Yemen to complete a 5-month investigation into the American-born cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, who is linked to 3 of the 9/11 hijackers, the Fort Hood attack, the attempted Christmas Day bombing, as well as the most recent failed attack, the one this past month in Times Square. The Washington Post recently described the documentary she produced as explosive and hard-hitting. It showed the critical information about Awlaki and his mysterious return to the United States in October 2002 that was withheld from investigators with the 9/11 Commission. We are very pleased to have you, Catherine, and we look forward to your conversation with the Secretary.
Thank you very much, Clark. And to begin with, it's a real honor and privilege to be here this evening and to be part of the closing session. I think I can take the liberty of speaking for many of us. It's been a very intense 2 days and a lot of very engaging conversations, and for the most part, very candid conversations about the issues facing Homeland Security and sort of the national security picture. And I personally can think of no one better to give us an overview and some context and to kind of wrap up some of these threads and questions that we've raised than Michael Chertoff.
And before we start, I'd just like to thank Clark for doing a great job organizing this. I'd like to thank the sponsors for supporting this, because I know that's how these things get done. And thank you, the audience, for showing up in between the cocktail hour and the dinner hour, which is always a perilous time.
And also Walter Isaacson for having the vision to put this program on for the last couple of days. Secretary Chertoff really doesn't need a long introduction. Many of you know him from his excellent work within the department and most recently with the Chertoff Group, which specializes in risk management. I first met the Secretary many years ago when he headed up the criminal division at the Justice Department. And I was told by my producer there that I needed to interview him because he was, quote, an up-and-comer. And that, of course, turned out to be the case. We discussed the very hard work that he had done at that time, looking at the 3 circles of the 9/11 conspiracy. So when I say he brings context, he not only brings context from his time at the department, but he brings context from those urgent months right after 9/11 when they were trying to piece together how the worst attack on U.S. soil was sort of encapsulated and put together and launched successfully upon us. I've had a number of people come to me privately over the last couple of days and ask a very simple question. If there was an attack tonight on the United States, let's say a man pad in Columbus, Ohio, that's a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile, 2 planes come down, 350 Americans are killed, and then we see something similar, kind of a hallmark of these attacks, sort of simultaneous attacks in a couple of different American cities. What is the incident response today at Homeland Security that perhaps we wouldn't have seen 5 years ago?
Well, Catherine, to explain that, we need to understand that prior to 2001, frankly, prior to 2003, there was not a system for managing domestic incidents in the United States that was very well developed. I mean, the default was the Department of Justice would manage, but that's really from a law enforcement standpoint. What the department did, and there was a companion presidential declaration, HSPD 5, that organized an incident management system on a national basis. And the idea is that the Secretary of Homeland Security, acting on behalf of the President, coordinates with the other federal departments to manage the incident, whether it be a natural disaster or a terrorist attack, across the entire spectrum of what has to be done to respond. And then that is also coordinated at the state and local level. So there's a law enforcement element, an emergency response element. In the case you raise, there'd be immediate questions about what do we do with the aviation system. So there'd be a need to coordinate with the Department of Transportation as well as TSA. There would be a need to coordinate with governors and mayors, and there is an existing network, both a law enforcement network and a Homeland Security Advisors network that would allow us to communicate virtually instantaneously, giving situational awareness to state and local leaders. There'd be a need to work with our foreign counterparts, and there's a mechanism to communicate with them. And this would be managed through this incident management concept, where we bring to the table all of the relevant agencies, either physically or virtually, in order to make sure that we were all on the same page. You know, the issue was raised earlier about planning, and I do think the good news is, perhaps more than was explained earlier, there has been a lot of planning that has been done at every level of the federal, state, and local government. We now work with state and local officials at the federal level to integrate our plans. We generally have a national plan that then cascades down to specific agency plans, and then those are integrated with regional and local plans for about 15 scenarios, which we've identified as the most likely catastrophic scenarios. Now you're going to ask the question, have we road tested this? And the answer is we have. In August 2006, when we learned, working with the British government, that there was a plot to blow up approximately 10 to 12 airliners flying from Britain to North America, we were able to turn around the management of that incident in less than 24 hours. And that involved integrating not only with DHS components, but the FBI, the intelligence community, our overseas relationships with the British government. As Jim May knows, we were on the phone with ATA, getting the airlines notified and reconfiguring the system to keep liquids off. And we did all of that within a period of, I say, far less than a day. So that system is up and running.
Okay, so if that's the plan today, what do you think we need for the attack of tomorrow that we don't have right now?
Well, I mean, the plans are, although they are underway, they are not completed. And part of what you need to do is not only to write the plan, but you have to train to the plan and exercise to the plan. We do have national exercise programs, and we do work, particularly, I should say, I'm falling into the same trap Fran did, which is, I'm forgetting I'm not the secretary now, but the federal government does have a system of particularly working with incoming governors and state officials to get them trained and up to speed as to how this system works. We've got to continue to develop that, but we also need to invest in what are the highest risk challenges in the future, where we've done some work, but I think, frankly, there's more to be done.
Well, that brings me to really the next issue, which is we've talked at length in the past about these incidents that are most likely and those that are of most consequence. And you've told me that you remain very concerned about a bioterror attack on the United States. Kind of game that out for us. What do you think it looks like? How do we respond? What do we need to respond that we don't have right now?
Again, to put it into context, I can break threats into two categories, those that are most likely to happen and those that are the most consequential. And I believe the federal government in particular has to put its special emphasis on the most consequential, where only the federal capabilities are really in a position to deal comprehensively with the issue. You'd have to say, in my book, the most consequential, reasonably likely in the medium term types of threats would be bio, cyber, and maybe a radiological attack. We've had a biological attack in this country. That was the anthrax attack. And the only reason it wasn't a lot worse than it was because the attacker deliberately chose to be forbearing and to limit the attack. If that attacker had decided to use that anthrax to generally attack the public, it would have made 9/11 look like it was just kind of the preview. So we've had that experience. What needs to be done? Well, we have done some things. We've built the first stage of a biodetection process that's been deployed in approximately 30 cities with sensors. But it's only the first stage. It needs to be expedited and made much more efficient and much speedier. we have stockpiled through HHS a significant number of the countermeasures for some of the most likely threats. Here's what we haven't done. We have not addressed the issue of distribution. Right. How do you get the countermeasures into the hands of the population in the time period that you have before it becomes too late? And that's an area where I think government has not done enough. The right answer here is to pre-position these countermeasures, if not in every family's house, certainly in every schoolhouse, and every firehouse, and every police station. And the obstacle to doing that is not understanding the need, because I can tell you when, I had discussions with the president about this. There was a clear view that we needed to do it. It was not the inability of the public to deal with this, because we road tested this with a pilot, and we found the public is capable of maintaining this kind of pre-positioned material. The problem is a legal and a regulatory problem. The FDA objects to distributing prescription drugs unless everybody sees a doctor, and the doctors have to determine there's a need. And that model of the way we usually do business stands in the way of dealing with this emergency response. So that's, to me, an example of a problem that we can cure, that we can identify, but it requires changing the way we do business from the ordinary way we do business to the extraordinary way we need to deal with threats.
And the second example you gave was cyber.
Well, we are, as I think you heard last night, we are the victims of literally hundreds of thousands of cyber attacks in this country every day. The most sophisticated ones tend to be aimed at stealing our intellectual property, whether it's classified information or economically valuable information, or something that has significance in terms of trade negotiations. We have obviously also denial of service attacks. They have tended in this country not to be terribly significant in terms of the total country, but if you look at what happened in Estonia in 2007 and Georgia in 2008, you can certainly see what could occur if someone wanted to try to take down a government system. Again, there is a comprehensive national cybersecurity strategy. It was launched in 2008. I think it's been largely carried forward by the current administration, but a lot of work to be done. Both in the bio area and the cyber area, there are two obstacles to progress. One is there are some really hard decisions that are going to disappoint some people. Just like in the bio areas, you might have to disappoint the FDA. In the cyber area, there are things we might have to do that are going to disappoint some people who have strong views. The second issue is you've got to make sustained investments over a period of time. And we are not good in this country at investing against medium and long-term threats without an immediate payoff. So there's a tendency to want to put money against the thing that happened yesterday or might happen tomorrow, even though the real need might be the sustained investment against the much more consequential attack that can occur in a year or two or three or four.
And the final point you made was radiological. Right. What form would that take?
Well, again, that's the so-called dirty bomb. Mm-hmm. It's the case where you take a conventional explosive, you put radiological material around it. It turns out in terms of lethality, it's probably not in the same category as a serious biological attack. But it again would have an enormous impact in a location which might be rendered unsafe for a period of time because you'd have to clean it up. Again, here there are discussions we need to have in advance and planning we need to do in advance. And it revolves around the question of how safe does something have to be or how clean does it have to be before you open it up again? Mm-hmm. What is our risk tolerance for cleanliness? In other words, there's a debate now going back, looking at 9/11, about the speed with which we opened up Lower Manhattan, and people who complain now that it wasn't sufficiently clean. But without venturing into that thicket too much, just ask yourself the following question. If the administration had been very risk averse after 9/11 and had said, we're not confident that we can be 100% clean in Lower Manhattan, so we're going to declare it off limits for a year, wouldn't that have given the terrorists a much, much more powerful victory than they got, and they got a very significant victory. So this all boils down to risk management. What is the risk we're prepared to tolerate? And when you set that barrier, are you mature enough to accept that means that there is going to be some residual risk and some consequence, and you have to be willing to accept that to go forward.
I think you're getting to the point that the expectations are so high in this country now that we need to almost be risk-free. So how do you have that public discussion where you say to people, you know, some people are going to die in the short to medium term, and we have to learn to accept that because we're trying to prevent the catastrophic attack which is going to cripple the economy?
Well, I think that's exactly what we have to say. And frankly, we have said it, and I think you've heard prior administration say it, the current administration say it. I think everybody, you know, from both presidents on down have said, look, we cannot guarantee perfect safety. And in fact, if we were to try to do that, it would be exorbitant, not only in terms of monetary cost, but in terms of cost to our society. So we have been consistent in sending that message, and I actually believe the public understands that. But then I'm going to say we do something that dramatically undercuts it. As soon as there is an event or a near miss, we go into a frenzy of recrimination and blame, which is designed to, quote, hold people accountable, preferably with some kind of a personal crisis where someone is fired and humiliated. And if you look at what happened after December 25th, you know, there was a near miss there. There were clearly lessons to be learned, and I think, you know, those lessons have been incorporated going forward. But there was a very immediate, strong, and I would argue maybe even almost somewhat hyperventilated response around, hasn't the system failed? Doesn't this show that everything we've done is worthless? Isn't everything totally broken? And we haven't made any progress since 9/11. Now, I think that's wrong, as Fran Townsend said and Mike Leiter said and others have said. But to me, the more interesting question is, what is the message you send the public and the people who work in government when that is your reaction? The message you send is, even a small attack, even an unsuccessful attack, is a total failure. And that means, what that says to the public and to the government is, no, you have to be risk-free. You have to guarantee us that nobody will ever get through. And we know that can't be right. We know that no matter how good a police chief you are, you will never have zero crime in your city. We know no matter how good a border security operation you run, you'll never have zero illegal aliens. So part of what we need to do to be consistent about the message is, when we have a December 25th, or Times Square, we have to be mature enough, both in the government and in the media, to say, yeah, we've got to look at this and see what we learn, but not to make this into a discussion about how everything has failed, everything is a total waste, and everybody ought to be fired.
Let's take that idea a step further. What message do you think that sends to the enemy? Clearly that emboldens them in their fight against us.
Right. I mean, part of what bin Laden talked about doing is bankrupting the country. And a lot of what they try to do is to get a reaction. Now, you know, someone in a prior panel talked about how in Israel, you know, they seem to be unperturbed by this. I frankly don't think that's actually right. But they've also lived with a much different set of circumstances than this country would ever want to live with. But it is true that when we become, we no longer become deliberate in our response, but we become hysterical in the response, we do wind up giving the enemy more bang for the buck than perhaps they have a right to expect.
Well, and those were failed attacks.
Right.
They were not even successful attacks.
Right.
And there was really hysterical coverage after those attacks.
And I think that, to me, is, you know, I've had discussions with the media about this, and everybody professes to understand this, and it's also a government problem, too. I mean, people, you know, in the congressional, you know, branch, a lot of them are quick to jump up and immediately, again, I'm not saying there shouldn't be criticism. What I'm saying is, what's helpful is criticism about, let's unpack what happened. What's unhelpful is, everything is a failure, everything is a waste, everything is broken, and everybody ought to be terminated. That's not helpful, because what that tells you is that a single failed attack is the same thing as a 9/11, and they're not. And if we can't calibrate our response, you are driving the operators to get to a risk-free model, and that's going to be not only exorbitantly expensive, but it yields the following phenomenon. And I'll give you a great example. Right after December 25th, I started to read people say, the watch list is too small. We have to the no-fly list. The no-fly list, which actually prohibits people from getting on airplanes. People were saying it's much too small. We have to broaden the criteria. Now, I can tell you, going back to 2007, so it's got to be 2 or 3 years prior, there was a steady drumbeat of complaining that the no-fly list is too big. And by the way, it wasn't very big. I mean, this was public. I made it public at some point. I think it was less than 2,000 people globally who were actually on the no-fly list, not just selected, but not allowed to get on airplanes. And that was the product of a lot of careful thought. So what happened on December 25th? All the discussion and complaining about the list is too big and there are too many false positives evaporated in 1 second, and now it was you got to make it much bigger. And I can tell you, every single person involved in the process would bet their life savings that if you broaden the list significantly, in 3 or 4 months, the complaints about it being too big are going to come up again. So you can't run a railroad that way. You can't change your strategy. It's like if you're trying to steer a ship and you have your charts and you have your course, every time you get a wind change, you can't tear up the charts and tear up the course and start to replot it. You've got to be able to be consistent, and that's the kind of deliberateness we have to become ingrained in carrying out in our response to these events.
I just want to sort of get into what you said there a little further. So what do you see as our longer-term strategic goal? And also, what do you see as the message that we're trying to present, this counter-narrative to their message?
Well, so let me break it into, I guess, 3 answers to that question. First of all, what do I think from the standpoint of the federal government ought to be the primary focus over the next several years? And I say primary, not exclusive. Right. I think the primary emphasis has to be on the high consequence attack. Nobody else can deal with it in the same way the federal government can. It requires cooperation with the states and locals, but they can't do it without federal support and federal integration. And that means the kinds of things I've talked about, plus a major 9/11 type attack, a major multifaceted attack on our networks, and a major, obviously, a nuclear attack. The second level is how do we deal with the more consequential, more likely but less consequential attack. And again, I don't want to be misunderstood. Any attack is a terrible tragedy and a bad thing. But a Major Hassan, a bomb in Times Square, is the kind of thing which would be confined in its scope, and it could frankly be very well handled by local authorities with the federal government standing in support. And the state and local authorities have gotten better and better and more sophisticated in dealing with those. So we need to make sure that we're properly allocating responsibility for those at the local and state level where I think the point of the spear is. And the third piece is how do we deal long-term with the strategy? And that has to do with how do we begin to shrink the recruiting pool with which terrorism is developing its kind of flow of operatives. And I'm the first to say we spent a lot of time thinking about this. I don't think we fully understand it. It's clear to me that we are dealing with an ideological movement. And I say ideological rather than religious because although there's a religious language that the leaders of this movement have essentially adopted and distorted from Islamic, mainstream Islamic thought, it's really not about Islam. It's really a kind of an extremist ideology that uses the language of Islam as a kind of a recruiting tool. And what they're really after is to get people who are disaffected and alienated from modern society for a whole host of reasons, and to build a narrative about a world which is unfair, which is oppressive, and which has to be the subject of an attack. And if you look at the recruiting pattern, what you see is they often recruit people who are disaffected, and these people almost become suicide operatives before they even nominally convert to Islam, which tells me this is less about the religion and more about an ideology misusing the language of a religion. So we need to understand how do you counteract that ideology, and that means you've got to start to talk about the areas where recruiting takes place. A lot of it's taking place overseas. And we need to understand how to work on the ground in those societies with those communities to come up with a kind of a counter narrative. Some of it is happening in our own country. And to me, the critical element here is it's got to be the communities that take the lead. The US government cannot tell people what Islam really stands for or how they ought to live their lives. It's got to be the religious and community leaders where the recruiting is taking place who take the responsibility to explain this to their own members and to their own young people.
That brings me to the next area, which is what you describe as ungoverned space, or what I might describe as these emerging threat hubs, especially overseas. Let's begin with Yemen in particular, because this is really the base for this American-born cleric, Anwar al-Awlaki, who I think a lot of you know has been linked to more than a handful of attacks in the last year, linked in the sense that the people who have committed these acts have been inspired by him. He has in some way validated their acts of violence. And one of his great strengths we found through our reporting is that he was born here, he lived here for 21 years, and he really gets us how we think in our political system.
Well, again, I mean, part of the recruiting element is to find people who are able to speak the language of the recruiting pool. And one of the things that I think I said this 3 or 4 years ago, one of the things Al-Qaeda consciously is doing, and similar groups are doing, is recruiting Westerners who are clean in terms of their records, who have legitimate Western passports, who understand the culture, and they're bringing them in, trying to indoctrinate them, train them, maybe even get them a little bit of combat experience and then send them back against their home countries. So getting people like Awlaki or Adam Gaddan, who's over somewhere in Pakistan, to use the vernacular of the home country is an important part of what they do. But the flip side of it is, although the internet has given them a greater reach, the most significant pockets of danger are still the areas where you can actually train, plan, and even experiment with laboratories. That's what we found when we went into Afghanistan in 2001 in Kandahar. They were doing lab work, trying to come up with weapons of mass destruction. So that's what we have to watch. And the danger is that areas of the world where you do not have governments that have the willpower or the capability to control their own domain, cede a portion of that domain to terrorists. And these terrorists now have areas where they can get involved in drug smuggling and other illicit financial activity. They can begin lab experimentation. They can really do some serious training and recruiting, and they can network among themselves. So, you have someone from Nigeria training in Yemen and being launched on an attack in the United States. And that's very concerning. So it means that we no longer can treat what goes on in Somalia or Yemen as something that's not our problem, because even if we leave those areas and we turn our back on them, that problem is going to follow us.
Let's just sort of stay in that geographic region and talk about Somalia as well. What we've seen through our reporting is that really over the last couple of years, there's been a fairly steady stream of Americans of Somali descent who have left the United States and gone to Somalia to join a group called Al-Shabaab, which translates as Mujahideen Youth. And I think significantly, their sort of chief of propaganda, or at least the Western face, is a young man who couldn't be more than 25 years old, who's from Daphne, Alabama, yet another American who's kind of the guy in the front of the shop. How do you see those two countries in the next 5 years? Are they becoming, in effect, the new Afghanistan in terms of providing that training ground for American citizens, others from the West?
Well, I'd argue Somalia really, in a way, is the new Afghanistan, or it's part of the new Pakistan, the new Waziristan area, and it may ultimately succeed that area. But if the Pakistani government is able to ultimately force some Al-Qaeda out of there, and if we're able to force them out from what we're doing, they're going to go elsewhere. I mean, that's been their pattern. If you go back in the 90s, when Chechnya was very hot, there were Europeans who left Western Europe, went to Chechnya to fight, and then they came back. And some of them became the cadre for Al-Qaeda and similar groups in Western Europe. That's what you have to watch in Somalia, is it creates an area where you can begin by enlisting people to come from the US or Western Europe to fight against, the Ethiopians or some oppressor. But once they're there and they're trained and they're indoctrinated, they're sometimes told you can do more for the cause if you go back home. And that's what I think you see with the Zazi or with the flow of people you see into Somalia. And frankly, we have to watch that in our own continent as well, because there are areas of ungoverned space that we have to worry about even in this hemisphere, which could potentially be problems in the future.
Let's talk then about where you see terrorist organizations using South America as a launching pad, and I'd also like you to touch on Hezbollah. We've spoken a lot about Al-Qaeda, but we really have not spoken at all about Hezbollah and whether it really can reach into this country.
In one of the earlier panels, I think the question of Hezbollah came up, and I think the questioner said, attributed to somebody the description that it's the A-team of terrorism. I think actually I used that. Although in fairness, I think I credited Richard Armitage, who I think actually coined it. And it's still true in the sense of sophistication, power, and global reach. Hezbollah makes Al-Qaeda look like a kindergarten group. Now, they're more disciplined and they operate in a much different ideology, a much different framework, and their relationship with Iran puts them in a different position than you would find, let's say, with Al-Qaeda, which doesn't have the same state kind of sponsorship. But I can tell you that the Iranians, and then when Hezbollah was formed, their allies in Hezbollah have been global in their ambitions for decades. About a year ago, I met with an Argentinian prosecutor who was looking at the bombing of a Jewish community center in 1994, I think it was, in Argentina. And he told me he had discovered that within a very short period of time after the Ayatollah Khomeini took power in Iran, they were sending people into South America to start to embed themselves in Argentina and other parts of that continent. And of course, now you see, the relationship that's burgeoning between Chavez and the Iranians, which of course is more concerning and creates more avenues to bring Hezbollah in. The concern is that, if we were to get into a situation with Iran where we had, let's say, a much more tense operational context, this is part of what the response might be. And so we've got to look not only at the most immediate threat, which is the one that we're currently engaged with, but what might be future threats.
And before we sort of leave this issue of American recruits, what do you think the sort of special challenges are? For example, when we researched Anwar al-Awlaki, what we found out about him is that as a child, he grew up in Yemen. He actually has 2 passports, Yemeni and American. And when it came time to go to college, like all good terrorists, he chose to come to this country. And in Yemen, he told the government, he went to the US Embassy and he said, I'm actually not an American, I'm a Yemeni national, and I would like to have a student visa to go to the United States. And this helped him qualify for $20,000 in scholarship money that was paid for by you and me. He gets here, he perpetuates the fraud, he knows how to work the system. So how do you deal with what appears to be a rising tide of American recruits who know how to work the system?
Well, one thing we do, and I'm going to go back to a conversation I think we had when I was head of the criminal division. I often see reports, media reports, that say, well, after 9/11, all these, people were investigated and there was all this activity, and look, very few cases turned up with terrorists. And what we told everybody at the time was, a lot of times we're going to uncover information about someone that may not be sufficient to charge them with terrorism, but is going to raise a concern in our mind that they may be affiliated with terrorists. And if independently we have a legal basis to charge that person and deport them, we will do that. And that's exactly what should have happened in this case with Awlaki. If there was a basis at the time, and I'm not sure there was, but if there was a basis at the time to say this guy is connected or is doing things that raise a concern about a threat, we don't have to wait until he's got the bomb built and he's ready to light the fuse. If we can take him out on a student loan fraud or a false statement to the government and we can remove him from the United States, we ought to do that. And I specifically remember telling people in the press, you're going to be disappointed. Unlike when we did organized crime cases in the 90s when everything was built carefully over time, and then there was a big announcement and a big perp walk, and it was very dramatic. We're not going to take chances with this kind of threat. We're going to use even a low dramatic a method to incapacitate that person before they're capable of ripening to a threat. So to me, the lesson of Alaki is that that's the right strategy. Sure, it's going to create frustration because there's not going to be dramatic cases, but I think it's important not to play games and wait to the last minute.
Well, disrupt early,
Correct.
essentially.
And the other thing about early disruption is this. Time and again, I've heard people say, well, you arrest a bunch of folks, and they're really hapless. They look like a bunch of what in New York they call mopes. And these guys aren't serious threats. They're just kind of playing paintball. And I can tell you, first of all, from my own experience, I used to do organized crime prosecutions, including homicides. And most of the people I prosecuted or dealt with who were professional killers were pretty stupid. But they did have the faculty of being sociopaths. They were willing to kill. So you don't have to be a genius or a television villain to be a risk. You just have to be willing to strap on a bomb or make a bomb. And the second kind of heuristic device or kind of mental test you can use is ask yourself this. If on September 10th, 2001, the United States government had arrested 19 people in the United States and had a press conference and said, we've arrested 19 people and we frustrated a plan to take over airliners with box cutters and knives and drive them into buildings, how many of the stories would have been, the government is hyping this, it's ridiculous, it could never happen? And when you answer that question, it tells you that sometimes what seem to be little cases are actually very big cases.
One of the things that struck me in a panel earlier today was what the head of the National Counterterrorism Center, Michael Leiter, said in terms of the amount of data that is coming into that center on a daily basis. He said somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 pieces of information. How do you identify information that is worth sharing? And how do you identify that information that we need to drill down on?
I think there are two things you can do. One is, it's very clear as we collect data, you can get swamped by it. And so there are analytic tools and ways you can help identify patterns in the data or analyze the data and present it in a form that allows it to be more easily understood and assimilated. But the second thing you can do is you create a strong relationship between the consumer of the data and the analyst or the producer of the data. In other words, as a policymaker, you need to be very clear and very frequently in contact with the people who are providing the intelligence so they understand what you need. And that helps them do a better job to provide you with the analysis. When I was secretary every day, 6 days a week, I met with my intelligence people and my operators, and we went through the day's intelligence reports, and we talked about what was the significance of the threats that day. And the idea was you didn't leave the meeting without either having further action to be taken on an analytic side, in other words, collect more information or let's drill down, or taking operational steps. Maybe we have to adjust something at the border or do something different at TSA. And the idea was to inculcate in the intelligence providers the idea that what they're doing is meaningful, that we're not just collecting information so we can read it and go, wow, that's pretty amazing. We're collecting it for action. And that means it's on the policymaker to communicate what actions are important and what information is needed to make decisions, and that's what helps the analyst go through all the massive data and pick out what's important.
Do you think it's a fair assessment that after 9/11, because there was such an emphasis on intelligence sharing, that intelligence became like a hot potato that people were really concerned about passing around a lot, but people weren't necessarily taking ownership of that information?
Well, this is going to come back, Catherine, to the earlier point I made about risk management and about the question of how do we deal with an event after it happens. The problem with looking backwards in hindsight and saying, oh, you missed this, is it runs the risk of creating a mentality where people in possession of information feel that the safest course is let's provide it to the policymaker. We can inundate the policymaker with every scrap of information, and then that gives the intelligence provider or analyst the ability to say, I told you so. And here's the danger to that. The danger to that is that in the signal, in the noise, you lose the signal. So what a good analyst does, and again, this is part of the relationship between the consumer and or the policymaker and the analyst. What the good analyst does is takes responsibility for saying, here's something that's really worth worrying about, and here's something that's not worth worrying about. And at the same time, as a decision maker, particularly if you've gotten some experience and you've seen a lot of traffic, you do learn to say, I think this is important, I think that's not important. And one of the things I valued in my senior leadership in the intelligence group at DHS was they would come to you and say, here's something, it does seem on the surface to be important and imminent, but we think that it's not significant for the following reasons. And then I had to make the judgment, is this worth pressing the alarm or not pressing the alarm? And that's, part of the job. And if you make a mistake, you should take the responsibility for that. But particularly for the people lower down the food chain or lower down the hierarchy, it's very important that in the after action, a reasonable lessons learned not become a let's find somebody to punish because they didn't, they missed this little scrap of information.
One of the things that struck me when we talked earlier is you said that one of the most sort of impressive experiences you had was going to the Oval Office and sitting down with the president every week and understanding his priorities. Maybe you want to explain that further.
Well, and I think that, this has been discussed publicly. During my tenure in second term, once a week, the head of the FBI, the Attorney General, myself, either the DNI or the head of the CIA, Mike Leiter, the National Security Advisor, and the Chief of Staff would meet with the President and the Vice President. We'd go over what was happening operationally in terms of Homeland Security. And it was a great way of the President making very clear to the senior leadership what his priorities were and to force action through the bureaucracy. The biggest challenge with a large organization, to be honest, it's true in the private sector as well as the public sector, is how do you put urgency in the people who day in, day out have the responsibility. And at least my experience in the federal government is when the president sends a message through the senior leadership, this is what's important to me, and I'm spending my personal time doing it and drilling into it, that is turbocharges the way the process works. And it certainly was helpful to me in terms of being able to calibrate what was important. And also I think it was important to the president to feel confident that the people he was trusting to carry out the most sacred responsibility, which is to protect Americans, were on top of their game.
Do you think the mission has become overly politicized?
Well, I don't think the mission is politicized. I think that, we live in a political environment, and there are people who, no matter what happens, on both sides, will immediately leap out, preferably in front of a camera, and, start a barrage of criticism. And I really firmly believe that national security ought not to be political. It doesn't mean we shouldn't disagree about stuff, but it should not be an occasion to get out and score points and immediately try to go for the political jugular. And sometimes we lose sight of that fact. And I mean the media, to be honest, fosters a little bit of that too, because I think they sometimes tend to shop for the person who's most pungent, and usually a moderate response isn't the most pungent response. But it's important for everybody, the senior leadership involved in both branches of government, actually all three, to be very deliberate and sober about the messages we send to the people in the field when we're inconsistent or overly preemptive in our reaction to failure, or when we appear to make it all about personal blame assignment as opposed to how do we deal with retooling the system.
Well, this is the difference between accountability and punishment.
Right, and accountability is, what does that mean? I mean, it's like a trope. And we had, someone on the media panel talking about holding people accountable. Well, I mean, that's true. We should be held accountable. But it's very easy for that to be. And I saw it after the 9/11 Commission. Let's find one person and really hang them out to dry. And in a way, that's an easy answer because it absolves all of us of responsibility. If it's a single bad person, we'll fix that individual's wagon, and then everything will be hunky-dory. And then the fallback position is let's reorganize or rewire. In the end, you can rewire to your heart's content. The wiring only works if the people who operate it are doing the right thing. And there again, a lot of it has to do with the overall message and policy we send, both by what we say in advance in our planning and by what we say in retrospect when we look backward.
One of the things that struck me today when the Pakistani ambassador spoke is he said that in his country there had been a real shift once the government there was able to communicate to the people, we're not fighting this war for the United States, but we're fighting this war because Al-Qaeda is attacking our country. Is there a lesson that we can take from that?
Well, I think what I said earlier, it resonates with us, which is the community has to take ownership. We can help that happen and we can tee it up, but we can't do it for them. And that means the community where the terrorists are recruiting have to rebel against it. About 3 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, it was kind of an extraordinary thing that emerged. Zawahiri, the number 2 in Al-Qaeda, did a town hall meeting. And it was an internet meeting. And he was engaging with people who were emailing in from various parts of the world. And it was shortly after Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, which is the North African branch, had blown up a bus of Algerian school children in the course of trying to blow up a government building. And there was some very negative, hostile reaction to Zawahiri from people in that back and forth who were saying, how do you justify killing school children, Muslim school children? How does that advance the cause of Islam? And he was trying to rationalize, well, I mean, in a way, what he was saying is sometimes you have to break eggs to make an omelet. But the people were not having it. And there have been some developments in the last couple of years where imams or religious leaders who previously were writing tracts that seemed to support extremism have begun to now repudiate that. And Al-Qaeda then obviously claims that they're being duped or being forced to do that. So it would be wrong to say that we're not seeing progress in the opposite direction. The tough thing for us is, how do we facilitate that and encourage it without getting our fingerprints on it in a way that discredits it? And that's, I think, one of the big strategic challenges that we face.
Well, one of the questions I asked earlier, particularly in the case of Anwar al-Awlaki, is that he's got a message that really sells, but when you actually sort of peel back the layers of his experience here in the United States, what you find out is that he's a fraud. He was picked up 3 times for soliciting prostitutes. He was picked up for loitering around a school. And yet, I have always been surprised that the U.S. government has not been more aggressive in trying to hit home those facts in an effort to discredit him. But I think this gets to the issue, how dirty do you want your hands to get to win this?
Yeah, you can't, I think Mike Leiter said this. This can't be about, pushing people into something. It's got to be about giving them the opportunity to find it themselves. And that means doing things to facilitate, and frankly, a lot of it is on a very, very grassroots level. It's hard to do top-down. It's got to be bottom-up. And that's an area where sometimes Americans who are relatively new to parts of the world like South Asia actually can learn a lot from some of our colleagues like the British and others who have a better feel sometimes for the cultures in some parts of the world that we're now operating in.
We often talk about Al-Qaeda like it's a big box chart. Lots of boxes, very sort of military in its structure. What do you think it really looks like today?
There was discussion over the last couple of days about whether Al-Qaeda has now formed alliances with other groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba, and what does this mean in terms of, is it morphing? I believe I'm right in saying if I go way back to the 90s, and there are probably some people here who could correct me like Peter Bergen if I'm wrong, but I believe that the original concept of Al-Qaeda was the base. It was not meant to be a single hierarchical organization where everybody swore an oath to bin Laden. There were some people who did do that, but it was also meant to generally facilitate a movement across the entire then Middle Eastern world and maybe beyond. So I think from the very beginning, there has been a network rather than a very hierarchical military-style organization. And I think we've gotten very fixated on where the boxes are, and they're more focused on moving the network back and forth. In fact, I believe that even Khalid Sheikh Mohammed may not have actually taken the oath to bin Laden, but nevertheless, you'd be hard-pressed to deny that he was a very, very senior leader and operator for al-Qaeda. So I think you need to, the boxes are useful, but to me, again, I come back to the fact this is a movement, and it's an ideology. It's not about a kind of a Western-style, strictly organized type of hierarchy.
Before I open up for questions, what are the 3 things in your mind that Homeland Security is not doing today that it ought to be doing?
I think we need to press forward on the Fusion Center concept, which is integrating with state and local officials. We got a good start with that. Chief Bratton was a real leader in helping us forge alliances in terms of flowing information, but there's more of that has to be done. I think in the area of cybersecurity, the government is moving forward on the initiative, but it's slow. And partly that's because it's complicated, and partly it's because there are a lot of stakeholders, but partly because there's some politically challenging areas in this field. What is the role of the government? Should the government sit on the internet? Well, there are governments that do that now, and we're not always happy with the way that works. On the other hand, how do you get the benefit of what the government's capabilities are to protect the private sector? So there's, I think, more work to be done there. And then I'd have to say, I have to echo what Senator Talon said. It's disappointing that we're cutting back on our investment in biosecurity. That's an area, perhaps more than any other at the high consequence end, where it's not a theoretical threat. It's happened. We had a biological attack. So we don't have to ask what it would be like. We only have to imagine what would happen if the perpetrator decided he didn't want to stop at a relatively small number of victims. And the tools are there, but we need to make the investments, even if the positive results will not be necessarily felt during this term of office or the next term of office. That's what I mean about long-term investment.
I'd like to open it up for questions. I'm sure there must be some in the group. Yes, just over here in the T-shirt. Hold on, just 1 second. The mic's coming right your way. You just tell me your name. Just tell me your. Just tell me your name as well, please.
What bothers me in listening to this is the frustration is that we're fighting a war with one hand tied behind our back. How difficult that must be for you. And I don't hear many people who have much more information than I do talk about the one thing that would seem to me has been overlooked, and that's money. Why can't we cut off the supply of money to all of these various camps, et cetera, and play as dirty with them as they're playing with us? The dirty hands concept was an interesting statement.
I think that's a very good point. Obviously, cutting off, the 3 ways you deal with the network: you cut off travel, you cut off money, and you cut off communications. And we've actually had some success in dealing with the money. Part of the challenge is there are now increasingly informal ways to move money around. And the other thing is we're beginning to see more and more al-Qaeda funds itself using criminal activity. For example, al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, which is an amalgamation of what used to be individual terrorist groups in various North African countries, is now actually helping ship drugs from South America into Europe. In the same way the FARC wound up getting into the drug business in Colombia to fund its terrorism. So as we've cut down on legitimate channels of movement like banks, they're moving illegitimately. But I'd like to take your question a step further and observe 2 other areas where we have important stuff to do, and we have to make sure we can do it. Ability to intercept communications. The struggle over whether we can intercept communications is critical to our ability to prevent attacks. We get the radar of the 21st century is our ability to understand what the enemy is thinking, and that is revealed through the enemy's communications. And when we make it hard to intercept those communications, that becomes a serious degradation of our capabilities. Travel. We've done a huge amount. Notwithstanding December 25th, we've kept a lot of bad people out of the country. The interesting thing is that in order to do that, we've accumulated a lot of commercial information. We reached an agreement with the Europeans in 2006 that gave us access to a lot of biographical commercial information that travel agents collect, which, had we had it in 2001, would have enabled us to identify at least 13 of the hijackers as being connected to each other. So you're thinking, great, that's a great story, and it is. Here's the problem. The European Parliament, which has now got new powers after the recent treaty, does not like this because they don't like information sharing. So they have now threatened to reopen this agreement and try to prevent us from getting the information. If that agreement were to be undercut or curtailed, we would literally it would be like blinding yourself to the kind of threat we saw on December 25th. So focusing on communication, money, and travel, if you ask me what are the hands that have to be free, those are the hands that have to be free.
I just want to follow up. Out in that coffee area, a couple of people approached me with a question which they didn't feel comfortable asking themselves, but thought maybe I could, and I sort of follows on this point. Their position was, why not just kick the you-know-what out of them and use overwhelming force, nuke them, was what one person said to me, because that will get them to stop. Now, that's very simplistic, but I think it speaks to this level of frustration that we want to take the high road, but in fact, this is a battle you've got to fight by getting into the gutter to do it.
Yeah, the problem is there's nothing to nuke. This is the challenge of a different kind of warfare, which is there is no center of gravity. And the other way you could use overwhelming force would be against the civilian population. When we fought World War II, let's be honest, the policy of the United States and the Allies at some point in response to the Germans was we're going to punish the populations of Germany and Japan, and we did it. We bombed Dresden, we bombed Hiroshima. Those were not military targets. That was and we had mutually assured destruction as our declared policy in the Cold War, which is basically saying, if you attack us, we're going to exterminate your population. Whatever the morality of that, it doesn't work if you're dealing with an enemy that believes either the population is all going to heaven, or they're indifferent, or their population is embedded among a lot of innocent people. So deterrence doesn't work. I think what works is, it's like a cancer. You wish there was a magic bullet, but a lot of times it's about treating it, managing it, reducing it, but understanding you're in for the long haul. We didn't ask for this, but you don't have the right to choose the challenges that you face. The challenges can come and find you, and there's no point in bellyaching about it. We just have to focus our strategy and our tactics on what the reality is.
Okay. Another question? Yeah, right over here in the front. A mic's coming your way. Hold on just 1 second, the mic's not on.
Buzz Zano here in Aspen. How paranoid should we be? How organized is Al-Qaeda and the groupings? What is the probability there's an operative attending the Aspen Security Forum?
That's probably pretty low, I think. I wouldn't be paranoid, and I think it's a mistake to elevate terrorists into superhuman status. They are incompetent in some instances. We've seen incompetence over and over again. Now, that's not a strategy. You don't rely on incompetence as your defense. But on the other hand, it's unwise to view them as omnipotent. And that comes to another point. Sometimes I get asked, we'll have like an airline security system and people wind up bringing a bottle of water through by mistake. And so we get the argument, well, it doesn't work 100% of the time, so isn't it useless? But that comes back to risk management. Risk management is about recognizing that if you build a series of systems, first, even if one fails, there's a backup. But secondly, even if you're not right 100% of the time, if you can be right 50 or 60 or 70% of the time, that dramatically reduces the risk. It doesn't eliminate it, but it reduces it. And also recognize you have what I call forced errors. If you make it harder for the terrorists, then their competence becomes more of an issue. So when I look at December 25th, I view that in part as a forced error. The reason the bomb didn't detonate is because it's a fairly complicated device, harder than if you can build a bomb and bring it in your handbag. And so by putting in place the measures we put in on airline security, we forced the enemy to build a more complicated and therefore more error-prone device. And that's exploiting, their incompetence. So you have to get out of the all or nothing mentality into the recognition that you're moving risk in the minimization direction, but you're never going to achieve that ideal because you can't ever achieve 100%.
Another question? Just over here. Thank you.
Adam Burlew. From a cyber standpoint, we had a great conversation yesterday. Do we get it? Are we paying enough attention? Are we, I think it was Chief Bratton who talked about you can expect what you inspect. Are we putting enough resources behind it, and is it really a priority?
I think it's a priority. I think people in the government get it. I think that we have had difficulty trying to organize a strategy in a different kind of threat than we're usually facing in the physical world. And that's because most of the assets are in private hands. And when we did the cybersecurity strategy and the current administration declassified, and I think that was, or a summary, and I think that's a good thing. The easiest part is to think conceptually about how you defend the government networks. And I think we can move pretty quickly to get that done. The harder part is how you defend private networks, recognizing that you have to think not only about network attacks, you have to think about supply chain, hardware and software, which people are buying, from all kinds of vendors without necessarily knowing, how robust the security is or whether there's something embedded in it. And you have to also be concerned about insiders, people who make mistakes in terms of how they manage their own IT security that undercut all the work that you could do from an external standpoint. If Aspen were to give out a goodie bag and you got a thumb drive, what would you do with it? Well, I would throw mine out. Not that I don't trust Aspen, but my general rule is if you get a thumb drive from someone that you don't know, you don't insert it into your machine. But not everybody believes that, and we paid the price for that. So because it's hard, I think there's been a little bit of hesitancy about tackling it. And that comes back to my earlier point. In some ways, government is most comfortable dealing with the simplest threats, the thing that just happened, and it's easy to gravitate to that because you know how to deal with it, and so let's beef up our aviation security, and that's important. But the problem is it's easy then to kick the can down the road on the very high consequence hard threats like cyber and bio, and to me that's where we really have to put effort. And the good news is Congress, there's legislation now that's really being I think there's an intensified focus. That's good. So I do think we're beginning to pick up steam, but it's going to be a tough road.
Another question? Right over here, please.
Hello, Mr. Secretary. Coley O'Brien. I'm with the House Homeland Security Committee. And I always believe that intelligence is our best defense against the terrorist threat. And you, being in the Justice Department, coming from the Justice Department, you must have been frustrated, as many were, that we couldn't get that FISA law extended. Why are we not able to gather the kind of intelligence that FISA can give us and prepare us to defend ourselves in a much better way?
Well, I wasn't particularly involved in that issue. I know there was a lot of time spent in the last couple of years of President Bush's term. I know Mike McConnell was very much involved in coming up with what ultimately was the compromise law that went forward. And I think that they were comfortable, once that got done, that they were able to do what they need to do. But one of the challenges that was exposed by going through this whole issue is we built a lot of our legal architecture for the 20th century. And the 21st century just has changed technologically and in a whole host of ways the kinds of things we have to deal with. And we're not very good at changing that legal architecture to adapt. And then you get these workarounds, and then we have a big kind of to-do about it and a controversy. So I would agree with you, as I said earlier. the ability to maintain visibility into communications is a critical element, one of the 3 critical elements of defeating the network.
Another question? Yeah, right over there in the back, please.
Bender Ward student. Before September 11th, the biggest attack in the United States was, of course, Oklahoma City. And since President Obama has been elected, I think the Southern Poverty Law Center said militias have tripled in size, the rise of the Tea Party movement, and earlier this year, the Hatari planning an attack on police officers. What are your thoughts on domestic extremism rising up again for another attack?
You know, I would say that, I mean, we've always had some domestic extremism. It really dropped off after Oklahoma City. And, you know, you have extremist environmental groups. There were some cases that were brought in 2007, 2008. You get this group, the Hatari. I mean, you do get these little groups, but I'd have to say they're not on the scale of international terrorism. I mean, their capability, they're not networked. They tend to be, you know, one-offs. And frankly, that stuff we've dealt with over the last 20 or 30 years. I'd be really careful about one thing. I think lumping the Tea Party in with that is a very, very misguided thing to do. Whether you agree or disagree with what people in the Tea Party say, it's not my understanding from the media that they're into violence. And in fact, it's a good thing when people peacefully demonstrate and express themselves. It's when people don't have the right to do that you start to get a spike in violence. So I mean, I would keep that totally separate from the groups like the Hatari or similar, these small domestic groups like you get in certain pockets of the country. I just think it's not, I mean, it is attended to. The Bureau spends a lot of time focused on this, the FBI, but it's not on the scale of what we face from international terrorism.
We've had the signal to wrap things up. Michael and I had talked earlier about how we might do that, and I had suggested, at least from my point of view, I wanted to share with you just briefly an anecdote from my experiences down at Guantanamo Bay, because I think these discussions can be very theoretical, but if there's an experience that I've had that has really reminded me about the darkness of these people who want to attack our country, it really was illustrated in this one incident. I was down at Guantanamo Bay last year for one of the last really procedural hearings for the 9/11 conspirators. As you know, there are 5 at Guantanamo Bay, and only 3 showed up for court that day. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed sent a message to the judge that he would rather sleep than come to court. Ramzi bin al-Shib, his lawyers argue, as you may know, that he's crazy and is in no state to come to court. So 3 showed up. And as we moved from the open session to the classified session, I've learned from experience that often that's when all the action happens, because no one's really in control of the court. And one of the conspirators, Walid bin Attash, took this legal pad that was on his defense table. There are 5 defense tables down the left-hand side of the custom-built court. And he made a paper airplane. And he shot it at one of the other co-conspirators. I call him Bellucci. He has a number of aliases. And he opened up this paper airplane, and he started laughing, and then Walid bin Attash started laughing. And I later learned that one of the guards had recovered the plane, and inside the paper airplane were either the flight numbers for 9/11 or the tail numbers or the tag numbers for those flights. And then it all kind of settled on me. The symbolism of the military court, these 2 men who made a paper airplane, this was no accident, and then the flight numbers inside. And that was a real window for me into the darkness of their souls and who they really are. That 9 years later, they were in a court where we were trying to bring some semblance of justice, and they were still mocking us and having a good time about it as well. So I just wanted to leave you with that anecdote because it constantly reminds me about the nature of the enemy in this war, the battle, struggle, however you want to frame it, what they're really all about.
You know, I don't think you can, I mean, that's as vivid as you can get. I mean, I guess, you know, it's a little stunning. And I guess to me what it tells me is, look, and we've talked about recruiting and soft power, and there's a lot of that we have to do. But we shouldn't kid ourselves. When you take out the people who are misguided or who wind up getting swept up, or the kids, and you take them out to one side, there is a hard core of very serious, evil, bad people there who are firmly committed that their mission in life is to kill Americans. And for them, it is something they glory in. It's not a matter of remorse. They're not going to see the error of their ways. They're not going to decide, if you give them a lot of kind of, love, that they really want to, give you all the information. They're going to be hardcore cases all the way to the end. And so with everything else that we do, the one most important thing is this. We have to match in determination and perseverance and conviction in the rightness of our cause what they have in their dedication and perseverance to do very evil things. If we doubt ourselves, if we start to figure out, geez, how can we just satisfy them? If we just pull out of here, if we just give up this, will that make them go away? And the answer is it won't make them go away. As long as there's a cartoonist somewhere that does a cartoon they don't like, they're going to be launching airplanes. As long as they don't like something that someone writes in a book like Salman Rushdie, they're going to be trying to get him killed. So in the end, when our patience wears thin, you got to remember that paper airplane.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming this evening.
Well, what a powerful way to end the Aspen Security Forum. My thanks to Catherine Herridge, and my thanks to you, Secretary Chertoff. I'll be very brief. This was an experiment, the first annual Aspen Security Forum, and certainly from our perspective here at the Aspen Institute, the forum exceeded our expectations, and I hope all of you leave Aspen tonight, those of you who don't live in Aspen, thinking the very same thing. I was struck by Ambassador Haqqani saying earlier today that, of course it matters if we ultimately kill bin Laden, but Al-Qaeda is bigger than bin Laden. It's an idea. And at the end of the day, that's what the Aspen Institute is about, as you just said so eloquently, Mr. Secretary. It's about ideas. The way to beat an idea is with a better idea, and that's what we've all been about these last 2 days. So we look forward to next year's forum. I want to thank our sponsors, AGT International, IBM, and Boeing, our supporting sponsors, the Ford Foundation, Northrop Grumman, and Stephen and Barbara Friedman, all of the organizations and individuals that are listed in the program, our co-presenters, the New York Times and Government Security News, and of course all of our speakers and moderators. Thank you all for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you next summer.